Hello, I'm Danny and this is my video on the labour market wage determination. It covers stuff such as why wages are at certain levels and trade unions. Here is your very basic sort of labour demand and supply diagram, which shows how wages are influenced by demand and supply. You've probably seen it before. It's almost exactly the same as a normal demand and supply diagram. It just says wage on the left instead. So basically, if you have a rise in demand for workers of a certain type, you'll have a right shift of the demand curve, an extension of the supply curve, and thus a rise in the wage rate. Obviously, the elasticity of supply is going to have a massive impact on how big this increase in the wage rate is, but we did that in the last video, so I'm not going to go over that again. Here are some very fun definitions. There are transfer earnings, which is the minimum payment needed to keep a factor of production in its present use. So say you're employing Johnny. Johnny picks tomatoes out of the ground. I don't think they grow underground, do they? Nope, they grow on branches, on little plant things. Anyway, if you employ Johnny, that's so embarrassing. You employ Johnny who picks tomatoes, and the amount you need to pay him to get him to continue picking tomatoes might be £10 a day. That's illegal. Child labour. Really bad. But if you pay him £10 a day, then he'll stay sort of doing his job, whereas if you pay him any less, he'll stop doing his job. Economic rent is the payment received by a factor of production above that needed to keep it in its present occupation. So if you only had to pay Johnny £10, but then you're paying him £15, you're paying him £5 of economic rent. In that diagram down there, we sort of represent economic rent. So total earnings of the worker are going to be the WQA, which is that big square thing there. Economic rent is WAB, because that's the amount you're paying them more than you need to. You only need to pay them the triangle that sort of sits along the bottom there, but you're actually paying them that much on top. So transfer earnings is ABQ, and economic rent is WAB. Trade unions coming up now. You either love them or hate them. Very controversial, great to debate about. A trade union is basically an organisation of workers who join together to further their own interests. Basically, they want to push up wages, and they tend to do this by limiting supply. Trade union markup is the addition to wages secured by members of a trade union compared to what they would have earned without the union. So say we have Timothy. Timothy would earn £10 normally, but he's in a trade union. They're fighting for stronger wages, and now he's getting £50. Go, Timothy. Trade unions can also do other things as well, like they can help out members who are in difficulty and stuff like that. Especially with teachers, I know everyone's part of a union, and if they've got a problem they contact them. Well, that's what I've learnt from Grantley off Waterloo Road. I don't know if that's actually true, but Grantley is the union rep at Waterloo Road. That should have said was. Grantley died, I think. Might have been whilst Harley was reading a poem. Don't remember it exactly, but I think that's when it was. Here we see a charming trade union diagram. This is basically the diagram that would occur in a normal sort of competitive market. So the trade union essentially acts as the monopoly seller of labour, and they're going to drive up wages by increasing the sort of wage they're setting it at from W1 to W2. And that basically means they're refusing to provide any workers at any level sort of underneath that wage. So we've got our new sort of wage supply line. Supply curve even, and the new wage supply curve is W2AS, so it's basically flat and then up. Looks a bit like a sort of frying pan. Obviously the level that the employer is going to employ is going to be the level at which that new supply curve hits their demand curve, the MRP curve, which is at Q2. So on the one hand, if you're employed now, that's great because you're going to get a higher wage, but on the other hand, the number of people employed has fallen from Q1 to Q2 due to this monopoly sort of trade union effect, which leads to unemployment. Although a trade union could act to essentially try to increase the productivity of its members and therefore shift the MRP curve to the right and thus the demand curve to the right, and then get more workers at a higher pay. Although this could happen anyway without the trade union needing to set the wage level, they could just push their workers for more wages anyway, whereas in this instance they choose to set the wage level. That was a competitive market situation. It's quite easy to model. Now let's look at a monopsony. A monopsony is basically a single dominant buyer, and in this case we're saying it's dominant buyer of labour. So basically they are a price maker and they can set the wage rate. the marginal cost of labour and average cost of labour curves, basically the supply curve there, they both slope upwards because they have to increase the wage rate to employ more people, because if they employ an extra person, they have to pay that extra person a bit more, and they also have to pay all the other workers a bit more, because they can't pay one cleaner £5, one cleaner £6, one cleaner £7. They have to pay them all the sort of same level. This is rather straightforward. So basically, in a competitive market, the equilibrium wage is going to be WC and the level of employment is going to be QC. So essentially, where average cost of labour is equal to the marginal revenue product. That's fair enough. Now let's look at the monopsony. If they're not influenced by trade unions, they're going to pay the wage at which the marginal cost of labour is equal to the marginal revenue product. So if you follow that line downwards, that'll be the quantity, but they're only going to pay the amount at which that line there crosses the average cost of labour. So they're going to pay less and employ fewer people. Not good. Here we see what is probably the most confusing diagram out of all the diagrams on the course, or at least I found it the most confusing. It's a diagram showing the monopsony in a market with trade unions. So we can see the competitive output and the competitive wage, competitive quantity of labour even, and competitive wage there in orange, and that's what we had in the previous diagram. That's the sort of number of people that will be employed and the wage they'll be paid at in a competitive market. Then in red we see our wage, as we saw on the previous diagram, under a monopsony with no trade unions. So they'd be paid wage 1 and we'd be employing Q1 people. Obviously the workers being paid this wage quite a lot lower than perhaps what they feel they deserve to be paid are going to be not very happy, so they either join or create a trade union, and the trade union sets the wage at W2. This creates a new sort of labour supply curve, which is W2AB, so if you follow along the light purple there and then up to blue, that's the new labour supply curve, and also the average cost of labour curve, because they're the same thing here. And then we can see the marginal cost of labour is the double kinked line. W2, A, B, E. So that curves along the purple, up the blue, and then back upwards through that sort of gap there. So, if we look at the sort of quantity, the monopsony can employ any quantity up to Q2, at which point they'll have to pay the new wage cost, the one set by the trade union. But beyond that, they're going to have to offer even higher wages, and you can see that from the little bit there, CE, which represents the new marginal cost of labour. I think most of the smaller details are quite irrelevant at this level. You probably don't need to write them down too much, as long as you know that a trade union basically increases wages and employment. So basically, if you look at that sort of purple line there, you can just keep sliding it up and up and up, and the closer it gets to the sort of competitive wage, the higher the wage and the greater the employment. So trade unions are actually beneficial under monopsony conditions. That diagram is probably the most horrible diagram on the course, so let's move on to wage differentials, which is a lot more fun. It's basically the differences in wage arising between individuals, occupations, industries, firms and regions, and any other things you can think there might be differences in wage between. I mean, even between genders, there's like wage differentials. There's just wage differentials between different ethnic groups, between anything. And there are a few reasons for this, and one of them we're going to look at here is elasticity. If there's elastic supply, you're likely to have a lower wage, because when the firm raises its wage, it'll get a lot more people coming in applying for jobs. So it doesn't need to raise the wage significantly in order to get more supply. So if you've got a high supply, elastic supply, you're going to have probably a central wage if you've got high demand, or a low wage if you've got low demand. Whereas if you've got inelastic supply, that means it's very hard for the firms to recruit new people. So if there's a shortage of people, they'll have to raise the wage quite a lot. So then you'll have a high wage, a very high wage if there's high demand, and a central wage if there's low demand. I think that's all pretty self-explanatory, and I'm pretty sure we did elasticity in the last video, so I'm not going to go over that again. And also, down the bottom, they're very obvious. If you've got a higher marginal revenue productivity, you're going to have a higher wage because you're more valuable to the firm. Here are some more reasons for wage differentials. Relative bargaining strength. If you're in a strong trade union, you tend to have higher pay, and if you're not in a trade union, you tend to have lower pay because you haven't got people fighting your corner. But we've got to be careful that trade unions don't get too strong. I think it's in France, they've got really strong trade unions, which means that it's very hard for anyone to get anything done. Next one is government policy. If we have a national minimum wage or increased public spending in employment areas and stuff like that, chances are there's going to be higher wages. especially with the minimum wage straight away, you can't have a wage below the minimum wage simply because it is set at that level. It's quite interesting. I think one year in the exam there was different table basically showing all the different minimum wages across EU countries, and there's massive discrepancies between them. Some of them were only just about double that you might have for sort of absolute poverty levels. It was just atrocious. Wage differentials between different groups. This slide looks really squashed upwards, but here are basically some different groups and reasons why people might have got different sort of pay levels. So obviously if you're more skilled, you're going to have a higher pay because there's more demand for you, and you've also got a higher marginal revenue product, so that means you'll have more pay. Obviously if you're unskilled, chances are there's going to be a much greater elasticity of supply in the first place, so you're going to have a considerably lower wage, most likely. Gender, male or female. Female people tend to work more in the public sector. They tend to work more part-time. Here's some really big stereotypes here. Might have kids, so they have to take a break from the career ladder. All of those things contribute to the wage gap, although I think it's narrowing, so that's good, I guess. Hours worked is the next one. Obviously, straight away, if you're working part-time, you're going to get less because you're working fewer hours. But in terms of pay per hour, because there's a much greater supply of people willing to work part-time, tends to be greater elasticity of supply and therefore lower pay. Also, you're more likely to be in a trade union if you're there full-time, so that'll lead to you getting higher pay. And finally, ethnic origins. Qualifications of ethnic minorities can be lower. Often they might have come from another country where they haven't had the same education system. Here's an assumption here, like some people obviously have massive qualifications and we get loads of doctors coming in from abroad. So, and also lots of ethnic minorities work in catering, which can be lower pay or it can be really high pay if you're really successful. I think we've got a really successful person nearby. Anyway, and also discrimination. Loads of people discriminate against people from ethnic origins, people from different genders, different backgrounds. So that's one reason that contributes to wage differentials. Labour market failure. Labour market failure basically occurs when the free market fails to achieve an efficient allocation of resources in the labour market, which is fair enough, and there's a massive reason for this, and the big one is discrimination. This happens when groups of workers treated differently to other workers in the same job. So say you've got Bob and Michael, and they're both equally good, but maybe Michael's got a ginger hair. He's got ginger hair, Michael's got ginger hair, and you don't like that, you think it makes him a worse worker, so you're going to pay Bob way more even though Michael is equally good. That'd be discrimination, although obviously discrimination tends to be more based on ethnicity and gender and stuff like that. Now let's look at discrimination. I think before we start we can look at the 9 groups. We've got 9 protected characteristics. We had a woman come in to talk to us about them, and you can't discriminate against people because of these characteristics. So age, disability, gender reassignment, if you're in a marriage or civil partnership, if you're pregnant or maternity, or if you think they're going to get pregnant or something, race, religion or lack of religion, belief, atheism, sex and sexual orientation. You can't discriminate against any of those things legally, although I think for disability you're allowed to positively discriminate. Here we have 2 different types of discrimination. I'm going to start with negative, even though it's on the right, because that's the big one. It happens when groups of workers are treated less favourably than others, which is great if you're in a non-discriminating firm, because you tend to have a bigger labour supply, because if one firm's said, we're not going to have any blonde people working here, then that's not a protected characteristic. Oof. If they say, you can't, I'm pretty sure you can't do that. If you say we're not having any blonde people here, then you're going to have a massive increased supply of blonde people to your firm, as well as all the normal people. Not that blonde people aren't normal, but you know what I mean. I'm just going to offend someone here. On the other hand, for the discriminating firms, they're going to have reduced demand for workers, and some workers might struggle to find jobs, so they might have to take jobs where they are overqualified for it, which obviously isn't great for them because they're not being put to the best use. They have fewer workers to choose from. If you're a discriminating firm, you've got fewer workers to choose from, probably higher production costs, which could lead to inflation if it's passed on to the consumer. You're going to be less competitive internationally. I think it's Milton Friedman advocates for the right to discriminate if you choose, because they say, at the end of the day, if you discriminate, then you're going to be forced out of the market because you're going to be producing at a higher cost than other people, so you're not going to be able to compete. And the last one is government money there. Obviously, if you are having discriminating firms in the market, then the government is going to have to monitor this and try to correct it. One way it can try to correct it is positive discrimination, which is when a group of workers is treated more favourably than others. So it could be good if it's positive government discrimination to offset negative discrimination. And I know they've got loads of people working on trying to improve equality and stuff for all. And then, on the other hand, it could be bad because employers might perceive the MRP, marginal revenue product, of particular groups of workers to be higher than it actually is. So say you've got Bob and Janice, and the worker decides that because Bob is he is better than Janice, he might pay Bob a lot more, even though Janice could be equally good as a worker. I'm actually going to end on one of my favourite quotes here. I think it's by Hayek, and it's, I don't know the exact quote, but it basically says, "There's all the difference in the world between treating people equally and trying to make them equal." And I think that's a great quote, because we're leaving the equal treatment of people, and the next video is all about the distribution of income and wealth, which is obviously about trying to make people more equal. So it's a very interesting quote there, and I really like it. If you don't, then that's a shame. That makes me sound so much like a free marketist, and I think the free market would be great if it actually worked, but it leaves so many people in poverty. I think it's just a really interesting topic to discuss, but we haven't really got time for that, so I'll see you for the next video on distribution of income and wealth. Have a lovely day, evening, night, morning, exam, whatever. Goodbye!